Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, good to see you, Amanda, Melissa. We're just going to let people come in. Hi, Cliff. Good to see you.
Hi, Miko.
Good. We'll get started in just a minute. We usually have people kind of join right at noon, 12 after. Has anyone been outside today? It's so beautiful. Yay, Zenobia. It's cold too. I know, and I'm tired, but I was just telling Ruby I was up a little bit later than usual because of the election. I usually don't like glue myself to a TV that late at night, but usually I try to read, so I think I didn't sleep that well. Well, I know people are going to keep joining, Zenobia, but I'm going to go ahead and get us started just so we can have the full hour. So welcome to our second session where we're deep diving into nonprofits, what we know, and also how they're changing. I started this same introduction 2 weeks ago, but I got my career in nonprofits 2 decades ago, over 2 decades ago now. And a lot is the same and a lot has changed, particularly in how we view leadership, how we view fundraising, how we really look at like who's in charge, who's making decisions, what it means to be at a nonprofit. So today I'm going to start off by sharing my screen. And this session is, let me just get there, called Shedding the Charity Mantra, which is really, deep diving into like what nonprofits actually are. I'm going to give a brief overview. A few of it, a little bit of it is a recap from last week. And then just talking about from charity to systems change, why we have nonprofits, what they do. And then we're going to really spend most of this time in a conversation with SVP's board chair, Ruby Love, who is not just our board chair, but someone who has decades of experience working with all types of nonprofits on all sides of nonprofits. And then we're going to open it up to questions. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. If you have any questions, throw them in the chat box. At any time, I'll just go ahead and check that. Please also know we are recording today. And so if you have to leave earlier, or want to share this with someone, we'll be releasing that next week. So I'll go ahead and get started. Here's what I'm going to cover today: the impact, the types of nonprofits, stakeholders, like who is a stakeholder involved, budgets, and ecosystem of change. I shared this last time, but I really think this is a great slide that comes out of the National Council of Nonprofits, which is just how many nonprofits are in the United States doing work every day, are really an important contributor to our economy, to our communities, to our democracy, and really, I think one of the bedrocks of our society. There are right now over, let's see, how many nonprofits are there? Thousands, over 24,000 nonprofits in Washington state right now. And if you deep dive into King County, you can see a lot. Most of them are actually centered, or about 8,800 in King County, really on the western side of the county. So the Puget Sound, where we are sitting right now. You can also see a breakdown of what they do. If you're interested in ever getting these charts, they're available by 501 Commons, which is another nonprofit resource center here in King County. So types of nonprofits. So there are a lot of types of nonprofits, and today I'm going to be talking about 501c3 nonprofits. All that means is that's a tax status with the federal government. What it means is that the 501c3s, we don't pay taxes. SVP is actually a 501c3, so we don't pay federal taxes, state taxes. We have to register with the state of Washington. And that donations to 501c3s are tax deductible. There are other nonprofits you might know and work with that are actually 501c3s and other types of nonprofits, such as a 501 C4, which is more political engagement, or even a 501c6, which is a membership organization. So often say or an association. So if you're a member of an association, say I was an architect and I was a member of the American Institute of Architects, they're actually a 501c6. Only tax deductions are only available to 501c3s, and I believe 501c6s, 501c4s, again, organizations that engage in more political activity. All that means is your donations are not tax deductible. When we're at SVP, we're usually talking about the first and third bullet of nonprofit. So direct service, where a lot of us think about as a nonprofit, like this is the ones that probably close your eyes. I'd say, imagine a nonprofit. This is what comes to mind. They're out there, they're making sure that people have food. They're making sure people have housing. They're working on education, kind of the bread and butter of what we think of as nonprofits. There are also memberships. There's both membership organizations and associations. So you can be a membership organization, say the Cascade Bicycle Club. If you're a cyclist, you might have heard of them, or the Sierra Club. And then there's the associations, more the professional association. Then there's advocacy organizations. Those are organizations working on behalf of a specific issue. They might be lobbying, they might be engaged in public campaign, they might be hosting candidate forums. Those can be and often are C3s or C3s and C4s. And often SVP grantees or nonprofit orgs fall into both the first and the third category. They might work directly on, say, providing affordable housing, but they also might be doing some advocacy work to ensure there's more funding for affordable housing, or that really the policy landscape supports more access to affordable housing. So you can be one in the same. And SVP, we're kind of, in a way, all three of those. The last category that I want to talk about is the largest amount, and why you see that 1.3 million in nonprofits in the United States is the bulk of those are actually churches and hospitals. And they often are the organizations that also receive, hospitals in particular, the most government funding. But again, like churches and hospitals take up a huge percentage of those nonprofits. Within a nonprofit, they really lumped in like 4 categories of stakeholders, and really at any point you can be all 4 of these. I am currently, I'm sure Ruby is as well, all 4. And why it matters is understanding that we're not just volunteers, or we're not just there to serve nonprofits, but we're also recipients of nonprofits as well. So I wanted to just dig a little bit into that. So nonprofit boards, they're required by Washington state law. So SVP has to have one, and we are really lucky that Ruby is our chair. And we are also, I know, joined by some other SVP board members today. Unlike a corporation, they are not paid. And they really have 3 basic duties, which is be a good steward, like make sure that, you are a good steward of those resources. That comes down to fiscal responsibility. You're putting the organization's interest first, not your own. And so when you think of like a conflict of interest policy, you're always putting the mission of, say, SVP above the mission of, say, maybe another nonprofit you work on, if we were doing a grant process. And then you're making sure that that organization obeys the law. That is the really basic foundation of nonprofit governance. We're going to go a lot more into that in our December session. So please stay tuned, because I know many of you might be interested in board service or have been board members yourselves. It can look really different to serve on a board. You can be on, you'll often call boards either working boards or more strategy boards. And there's probably, at the end of the day, most of us are going to be on boards that's everything in between. You're providing some strategy, but often you could have, so what's interesting is nonprofits are required by state law to have a board of directors. You're not required to have a staff. And so often there'll be small nonprofits that have no paid staff. And so the board of directors actually does a lot of that work. But we'll dig more into that in December. Nonprofit staff. So I just think this is really interesting. Nonprofit staff are a huge part of our workforce here. And I think, that's something important to recognize is they are full of like very talented people with both amazing lived experience, amazing professional experience, amazing educational experience. And so again, when we think about like who a nonprofit employee might be, they really span the same diversity as any other sector. And that they make up a huge amount of our economy. Volunteers are also a really big part of nonprofits. The statistics is that, 1/4 of Americans volunteer their time and treasure at some point in any year, and it's actually higher in Washington State, which doesn't surprise me, but is great. One of the things I think all of you, who come to SVP are here to do skilled volunteering. And one of the important things to keep in mind is volunteering doesn't just happen. There's often someone on a staff that's really coordinating those volunteers, and really doing that skilled volunteering takes a lot of work on both ends, both of the volunteer, but also the staff who are really preparing that experience. It has like a huge amount of impact on nonprofits to get work done, and there's a transaction cost. And I bring that up because that's just something to think about as you go and volunteer for a nonprofit is like working together shoulder to shoulder absolutely increases the capacity of organization, and recognizing sometimes when you like don't hear back from a nonprofit right away, like there's often a lot of stuff going on, and just transaction costs and working with any volunteer, like there is with staff. Think about like, I always think about, I'm so excited when I get to hire a new staff person. And I know those first couple months in particular, there's going to be a lot of a learning curve, and I'm going to spend more time training than I am going to be getting kind of the work output to be crass. And volunteers work just like that. And then there's clients. And the reason I wanted to have this slide in particular, and it fits in the theme of shedding the charity mantra, is when we think of clients, it's often the slide on your left. We think of kids, we think of people who need things. We think of really the term charity, but in fact, it is all of us. And a way to think about this is like, we have struggled, and we struggled certainly in September and October with poor air quality. And there are organizations working to ensure we have clean air and working on climate change. And we all benefit from that. We have, a really, we have a robust public transportation system, and there are organizations ensuring that we have those robust transportation choices. Actually, one of the organizations working on public transit is called Transportation Choices. They're a former SVP grantee. When we want something in our schools, our public school systems, if we're public school parents, we are the recipients of those nonprofits that you might not even be aware of. And I think that's important to think about is like, this is not a one-sided relationship but it's really an ecosystem. And at any given point, we might occupy one or all four of those stakeholders that I talked about. And thinking and framing about it that way really changed how I think about the world. We are really lucky that here in King County and Washington State, we have access to fair and accessible elections. But as we know, that's not true in every state. And there are nonprofits, not political groups, but nonprofits working every day to just ensure that people have fair access to voting. So again, we all are at any time both a volunteer, we might be a staff member, we might be a board member, but probably more than anything, we're the clients or the recipients of the nonprofit sector every day. I want to just touch a little on nonprofit budgets. So nonprofit is just a tax status. Like that's the only thing that makes SVP or any nonprofit, particularly 501c3, you are working with different than a private company. It's our tax status. It doesn't change how it changes not that much how we operate. I still have to make sure that people get paid. I have to make sure that, we have access to working equipment. I have to make sure that we pay our bills, that we're delivering our services. And so there's no, just like in the private sector, there's no one size fits all of operating a nonprofit. You have nonprofits that have, thousands of people when you think about the Wise or United Way or American Red Cross. And then you have smaller organizations like SVP who have 4 people. Or many of our nonprofit partners and grantees, I'd say, have no more than 10 at any given time. And so operating a nonprofit is as diverse as the private sector. One of the things that I wanted to touch on is this notion of overhead cost. My first job in nonprofits was as a fundraiser. And one of the things we were taught is to really show that, most of our money was going directly to services and not to staff. Well, one of the problems with that is that we had huge staff turnover because we weren't able to pay employees like a livable wage. And so, and we honestly, we didn't have, we had computers that took 30 minutes to turn on. So at the end of the day, we weren't delivering the services as well as we could because we weren't investing in that overhead. And so overhead is always important. So when you think about asking for an annual report or an impact report, keep that in mind. Is overhead, depending on the type of organization, is something you want your organization investing in. You want them to not sit there. Trust me, you want them to not sit there for 30 minutes waiting for their computer to turn on or have it freeze and get like the wheel of death, a few times a day, because then they're not doing anything. And then I'm just going to end on nonprofit challenges. So nonprofits face challenges just like any corporation. We're thinking about, just like probably every nonprofit, the word recession. But, there's also a strain to meet increasing needs. I know food banks right now are strained right now because of inflation and food cost. And yet funding remains, pretty, like people don't give more right now. But the need is higher. There are policy proposals that threaten all levels of work. It might be funding. It might be something that, it might be, let's take the environment. It might be an environmental policy. It might have a policy to do with how we build homes in Seattle. So at any given point, you're kind of living within a policy environment. Staff attrition continues to be challenging. As I said, keeping quality staff at a nonprofit, there's often this idea that you're kind of going in to do, you're there to sacrifice. And I think, this idea, and it's really been great to see organizations in Seattle and particularly some of our nonprofit partners like Choose 180 say, we're going to pay our employees a minimum living wage because we want to value them, and doing this work is valuable. It is just as valuable as working in the private sector. And so, there continues to be challenges at all times. Funding is always a challenge. And I'll talk about this in the next slide, but the way that nonprofits are set up is they're often competing with funding, with each other for funding. And actually raising the money to run and do their service takes up a huge amount of time. I do think, and one of the reasons I love SVP and its work in philanthropy, is there are ways to change this. It doesn't have to be a competition. We don't want, there is enough money in this region to make every nonprofit, work and work effectively. But that we've set up this mentality of really organizations competing against each other. And one of the things we want to do at SVP is figure out a way that really all organizations doing this important work are invested in for the long term. If you don't know SVP's history, one of the first things that we did was decide to give out multi-year unrestricted grants. And the reason that we did that is often if you are applying for a grant, it might be for a program, but you actually don't end up funding your basic operations, that overhead. Or you end up not doing your mission work because you're chasing down programs. And I've certainly done that. I've run very non-aligned programs so that I can go after that grant. And so what we said is we're going to do a multi-year commitment so you don't have to worry every year. You're not constantly spending time going back and writing a new grant, but also we are going to trust you to do with that funding what we want, what you think is best for that. And then the very last side is that we do this work, nonprofits do this work in concert with with really three other sectors that I grouped it into. So there's us, nonprofits who work on policy change, who often give funding, who provide services and do community building. There's also philanthropy, which is a funder, but can also take, not a lot of funders have done that, but actually get involved in policy change. And Ruby, I'd love to dig into that with you more. There's the public sector, which obviously next policy change is a huge funder. Often governments, I used to work for King County, and governments can't deliver all the services themselves. So they contract out or grant out to local nonprofits to do that work, or they provide direct services. So it really depends. They might fund an education program through a nonprofit, but they also say, pick up your trash and make sure you have a bus stop. And then the private sector, which has a huge role in policy change. If you just think about DC lobbyists, huge role in policy change for good and bad. They also fund, and they often provide volunteers. And if you think about maybe a day of service or a day of giving at your company, or they have a program where certain employees can spend a day of their own or a certain percentage of their time. I know Ruby worked on that program at Microsoft, so we could talk about that. And so that's really like the nonprofit 101. This is in a way been exactly the same as when I started, and it is starting to change a lot. I think who we see in leadership positions has changed. We are starting to see more Black and brown and people of color promoted into leadership. Boards are changing, but in a way, a lot of this has stayed the same for good and bad. And so Ruby, let's dive into that. But with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen. And if we could just pin Ruby and myself. Ruby, can you tell me who you are and a little bit about your career? Tell us all.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Ruby Love. I have been involved in the nonprofit sector and philanthropy for over 30 years, coming to the Seattle area from Chicago. And I came here with a consulting firm that was running capital and endowment campaigns. And my first clients were Cornish College of the Arts and Pacific Lutheran University. And that afforded me a connection to some of the most probably well-known and recognized philanthropy names in the community. But I think it's important for you to know a little bit about how I came into this work. It really is because of my family, my parents, and my grandparents too, for that matter. But my parents were very involved in the funding the Freedom Riders, and then going on into the civil rights movement. And being the parents that they were, they very often took us with them when they were raising money, asking for very modest amounts of money to support those movements. And I just met people and saw that encouraging their generosity was really around telling a story that connected with something that was important to them. And then I would say the gift my parents had was they knew how to build relationships and retain those relationships. And so it really just was something that I did around the dinner table, I did with my family, and it carried on into my professional life. And so that's a little bit about me. I am a part of SVP because I feel that that is actually foundational to the successes of SVP. Those of you who are here want to build relationships in community, and the community wants to know you. And so I think SVP is an organization that's set up perfectly for that to happen.
Thanks, Ruby. The first question I wanted to ask you, it's 3 parts, but hopefully I can say this easily, is I talked about how I alluded to how nonprofits have stayed the same and changed. And, in your career, what have you seen that's changed? What have you seen for the good? What has not changed and what needs to change?
Oh my, that is very big, Emiko. So I think one of the biggest things that I've seen in terms of change is that the field has opened up to the possibilities of, how shall I say this, of more people being involved with less rigidity of who can do what. And so we have brought volunteers really into the organization and engaged them with community. And we have, I think, crossed the bridge. The bridge has been crossed between companies, philanthropists, and foundations in a way that had not existed before. So I used to teach a class actually around kind of fundraising 101 and nonprofits. And we used to say you couldn't secure funding because everyone said they wanted money from Bill and Paul, Bill Gates, Paul Allen. And I used to say, well, do you have access to Bill and Paul? Do you have a specific link to them? And do they know anything about your mission? Well, what has flattened in our world is there's so many new ways for a nonprofit to bring their message to a philanthropist. It doesn't have to be those two guys, but there are so many new ways for us to bring our message and our mission to people who want to be generous. And the level of curiosity of the potential donor is greatly heightened. And so there's a greater, I think the access is greater. Now, what do we have to work on? I think one of the huge things we have to work on is a sense of belonging and the anti-racism that, and embedding anti-racism in philanthropy. One of the things that we know is that philanthropy is actually built on a white supremacist mindset that you are poor and you're that way, or you have less and you are that way because you are deserving of that status. And I'm going to help you get out of that status. No one comes into this life wanting to be in that status. No one comes into being an artist and wanting to star as an artist. And so I always say, you know, I say that one of the things that philanthropy has to do is to understand that it's got to relinquish the power that exists within the white mindset of I have and you don't, and therefore that's why I'm going to give. The giving needs to be back to what I said originally, the relationship that a person or an organization wants to have with community, and how community is going to be able to help that person satisfy that relationship and desire to improve our world.
I love that. And I think it's a great segue. And you may have already answered, but you know, I love the term, and you actually came up with the title for this session, which is Shedding the Charity Mantra. Like, what does that mean to you? What does that mean to you?
Well, you know, this, I think that it goes back to what I was saying, this perception that those who are coming to you for support are coming because they are less than in some way, but that does not exist, for instance, in the for-profit world. When one goes after an investment, investor dollars, those investor dollars are not because they are less than. It actually is because that company is positioning themselves that they're solving a problem that that investor feels that they can't do themselves. And so therefore they support that effort. That very same thing should be the mindset and the culture in the nonprofit sector. The donor comes to the table because the organization has citizen science that they're using. They have evidence-based work that shows that they know what they're doing, or they're trying to prove a process that they think is going to improve community and improve a situation. And so the donor is partnering with the organization to actually satisfy that. So that's removing that charity mindset and looking at it really as a partnership in terms of improving our communities and improving our lives.
That's great. Something else I been thinking about is as we come to nonprofits, and I'll say this from my own like path, is that I was most interested in working with direct service organizations. And through my career, I've really seen the importance of systems change work and advocacy. But can you share more about like why you think engaging not working to shoulder just with the direct service organizations, but also engaging advocacy is important for people who want to see change in the world?
Yeah, so you mentioned system change. And so when we talk about changing a system, we are talking about a lot of different elements that are going to go into causing that change of system. And I like to think of it, you showed in the slide, actually, the 4 bodies that come together essentially in our society. So there's the public entity, there's the philanthropic entity, there's the nonprofit, and there's the private. And so advocacy actually brings it draws attention from each one of those elements against an issue. And the nonprofit sector and the philanthropists, I should say, have to work together to do a couple of things. When we talk about changing a system, and we talk about that happening in particular at the government level, there are doors and windows. I always say, open the window, and if you can't get through the window, let's open the door to the legislator, the elected official that actually is developing the policy and the bills that are going to actually make the sea change in what we're doing. And I like to think of things like what's happening in terms of climate, or things that are happening in terms of our voting rights. Those are systems that we have in place that are causing something to happen in our society. And we have all of these different nonprofits, we have for-profits, we have government that are engaging in the work to change how our systems are working there. And advocacy on the part of philanthropy and nonprofit is such a key element to making that happen. And the big piece of it is we actually have power, and our power is exerted through advocacy. Hope that answers.
Yeah, I think that does. I mean, when I think about it, it's like, whoa, we're going into politics here. But the more that I think we've thought about it, at least on the board, Ruby, that you can't care about these things and not also pay attention to the policy framework that created and enables something. And often it's something that we don't even think about. So, I might care desperately that people don't have access to food, but, there's usually some policies that were created, say wealth inequality, and that if we really want to see change, we don't want to just keep showing up to do that work. For the rest, we don't want people to be hungry forever. We've got to look at policy change as well.
Right. And with advocacy, you can't just change things. The reason that advocacy is so important, change cannot take place with only sending money. Money is important. It's a tool. And it's, I may get the saying wrong, but you can't expect to have only one tool in your toolbox. You've got to have multiple tools in the toolbox to make system change. Advocacy is one of them. Money is another. And the other piece I think that's really big is the workshops and the learning. So what we're doing today is key to bringing people into the fold to understand, oh, this is why I need to be present. I actually need to understand all of the parties that are involved in our, kind of our ecosystem, and how do each one of them play a part in making systems change.
Yeah, I love that. I think about like at any point, like there are different ways you can step up and give. At every day that direct service is needed, and there is a place for someone to go in. There's a place for all of us to go and do that direct service, whether it's working at a food bank, or if you're more political, what do people do now? Do we still doorbell? I don't know with COVID, but I know we still do political text, or but there's also the important work to do in terms of that policy change. And you know, at SVP, we also do that skilled volunteering, which is about those long-term relationships, which I think are really, really important. So another question that I have is that, you know, when I look at who's joining us today, we have, you know, many people that might be starting for the first time or might have done many volunteering projects. But, you know, what are some words of wisdom that you might share for people looking to get more engaged with nonprofits?
Oh, well, you're needed. Number one, you are needed and you are wanted. And you are needed and wanted in multiple places and in multiple ways. So I like to, you know, so I have a strong background in fundraising, but whenever a nonprofit, an organization asks me if I can volunteer, I always say to them, actually, I want to do something other than fundraising. And the reason is because I actually have a number of other skill sets that could be advantageous to the organization. And I also want to learn in my relationship with you. So I'm just going to give you an example. So I am on the board of an organization called Earshot Jazz. And I agreed to join that organization, not because they asked me to come and fundraise, not because I knew a lot about jazz, but because this was an organization that had stayed the same size for over 15 years. And they wanted to grow in their exposure and also just in their influence within the arts community. And so that's why I joined that organization and volunteered for it. And so my work was in leadership development and volunteer development. It was not in fundraising. Yes, I raise money. Yes, I give them money. But, you know, so what I give that example to say, you may be an accountant, you may be recruited to volunteer or serve on a board or on a committee, but you don't have to be an accountant and in that role. You can expose yourself and your skills in other ways as a volunteer. So I always say be flexible in what it is that you find that you want to offer to a nonprofit. One of the things that's great about SVP is we actually make sure that your relationship as a partner is enriched with your engagement with our other partner organizations. And that enrichment takes place through the skills and basically the talent that you want to share with others.
Thanks, Ruby. I'm going to ask you one more question and just remind everyone, if you've got any questions, you can use the raise hand feature if you want to come off mute, or feel free to put those in the chat box. But I'd love to spend the rest of the time doing questions and discussions. But my last question for you is going back to something you said around one of the biggest challenges and things we need to work on as a nonprofit sector is our work on anti-racism and racial equity. And where could someone, if I'm going into a nonprofit to volunteer and I am not a person of color or I present as white, like what's something I should keep in mind as I go and do that work?
You don't know more than the folks who are there. That's the first thing I always say. Okay. You want to essentially position yourself as a resource, but only as a resource that when you're asked to share that, you should enter any relationship, I feel, as a learner, as opposed to a teller. And I think also being very conscious of why you were brought to the table and leaving your power at the door and coming in essentially to offer your resources, offer your time and your talent, and you know, just be conscious of the fact that you don't know everything, and that the organization that you are serving on, those that are there around the table or in the organization who are people of color, have experiences that have allowed them to get through life and get through life in a way where they have, you know, either created an organization or they're working on a program or, whatever. It's that whole position of whiteness feeling they know more than we know. Mm. Sorry, I don't know how else to say it, but
I think that
we walk through life as people of color, seeing and feeling that. And so it's great when we are able to access, fellow community members, and they come to us knowing that we have something to share. We know that they do, but we need to do it on a basis of equity and justice, and creating, if you've been invited in, it means that they're trying to create a sense of belonging for you. We would like for you to help us feel that same sense of belonging.
Thanks, Ruby. That's great. I just thought of one more question, which is kind of a loaded question, because I know how I'd answer it, but the world feels overwhelming right now. You and I both studied up late watching the news. I know because we were texting about it. So where do you start? Like, where can someone start when there's so many things that I could, I'm next to a whiteboard and I could write, easily 25 things that I care about, and I don't know where to start. Where advice do you have for people?
So let me ask a clarifying question of you. Where do I start in relationship to my anti-racism journey?
I'm sorry, to just service, to volunteering, to supporting my community.
Okay. So I always say, start with a level of curiosity. What are you curious about? What do you actually think you don't know everything about? And you want to learn more? I like to start there. Create a little list for yourself of, 2 or 3 things that you're curious about, that you'd like to learn more about, and who are the organizations that are fascinating to you. That I wonder who they are, what they are, and I'd like to get to know them a little bit. I always like to look, Google them, find out, are there people already in the organization that you have a relationship with, or that you know something about them? Mm-hmm. Also, do you know something about their work? And reaching out, one of the things that I find is that oftentimes people feel they have to be invited. Sometimes your curiosity of, I have found your organization to be so interesting to me for whatever reason, and I'd like to become more engaged. I will tell you, as a fundraiser or as a program officer, I would be thrilled to have 2 people just come to me in a year with just that openness and say, I would love to learn more about your organization and see if I can be of service. So I think that's a place to start. And then obviously starting with what you're passionate about. If there's something that is of great interest to you and you're passionate about it and you want to learn about it, you should, pursue that organization. I'm going to be very favored to say that SVP has such a myriad of partner organizations that you can always come and be a partner with SVP and find an organization or 2 that will, be a good match for you.
Yeah. And that was part of my loaded question is, SVP, if you, I'd say for everyone on this call or who might watch the recording later, reach out. You can find all of our contact information on svpseattle.org. But even if it's not a current nonprofit we work with, we have worked with over 100 nonprofits in King County. We also, between the board and the staff and our partnership, we probably are connected to every nonprofit doing good work in King County, whether you know it or not. I think one of the things that I am most proud about is SVP we see ourselves as a connector. So you might come to me and say, I care about, working on, I'm trying to think about, this is going to be totally, I have a dog, on something around dogs. And you know what? We probably know somebody else here who is working on that. And so one of the reasons to get involved with SVP and the partnership is just meeting other people or being able to connect on issues that you're interested in. I do probably, a third of my emails every day are connecting people with other people, regardless of whether it's nothing to do with SVP, except we see ourselves as a connector into that resource. So that is a great plug for SVP. I am looking, does anybody, we've got about 10 minutes. Does anybody want to come up? Oh, here, we've got a question, Ruby. I'll read it to you. So how do you think about accountability and transparency with respect to the ecosystem of organizations?
Well, I think as it relates to organizations, transparency is critical. It's important. And I think the transparency should start with the leadership of the organization, both the executive team and the board of directors. I think transparency on the part of donors is also very important. When we have donors that have ulterior motives and hidden agendas, it creates a lot of issues and problems for nonprofits and their leadership. So I think that nonprofits are actually designed to be transparent. The way we are governed, what the IRS even requires of nonprofits, what must be published. So our accountability and our transparency is what I would call much, much greater than the for-profit community. And so, it's paramount in our work. And if you align yourself with an organization where you don't feel that is actually a value of that organization, it's somebody to step away from.
Yeah, you know what? That reminds me of something that we heard a lot, SVP with more of a funder hat on, or heard a lot during really beginning of the pandemic, is that nonprofits for years have been asked to create an annual report or a grant report, or really show their work in a way that, not a lot of other businesses are, and that's changing. We are, but can you talk about kind of why that needed to change and maybe some alternatives to annual reports?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that people did not understand is that oftentimes all of that stuff was created and no one read it. It meant nothing to anyone. No one read the annual report. We would work and spend a lot of money creating those reports for essentially no use. And also the perception and the implication, I think, was always that you must not be doing all that you say you are, so put it on paper so you can prove that you're doing these things. The cost to the organization to create the documents and all of the annual reports and the semi-annual reports and the audits and all of those things were very, very burdensome on organizations. And what it implied was the donor essentially thought that you were not doing the work that you said you were doing. The interesting thing is that most nonprofits are doing the work without your funding, and then they come to you for the funding, and that supplements what they've been doing. So yeah, I just, I'm so grateful to see how some of those things that were albatrosses around nonprofits are actually being lifted. And it does not diminish one's accountability if you are in relationship with the nonprofit and the funding source.
Great. I think that, and Tolly Roush added a comment: all nonprofits 990s, their tax reports are accessible to the public on guidestar.org. Yes.
GuideStar Charity Navigator.
Yeah. Yeah. So then how do you know who's a good nonprofit, Ruby?
Well, I think there's a number of different ways to know. You know, are you, again, I got to go back to, are you in relationship with them? Are you convening, talking? Do you read their news materials? Do you pay attention to their stories? Do you have, yeah, are you in relationship with them? I think also what Tally just wrote, you can always look at what their scores are in Charity Navigator, and you know, there's other resources as well that are online that will let you know, you know, publicly whether or not they're actually doing what they say they're doing. I think the other, you know, big thing is that if you have a relationship with someone who works at a particular nonprofit, are you attending their programs? Do you find value in their programs? You know, people say, oh, I'm not sure if this arts organization is really spending their dollars in the way that they say they are. Have you participated in something that they present that sheds either a negative or positive light on it? Looking at SVP, what are the people who are partners in the organization saying about their experience with the organization? So you do have to do your work. You know, one of the things that I caution people of is with very large national and international organizations, you need to dig deep to know whether or not what is being done with your investment is what is actually reaching the people. It's not as difficult at the local level, in the city you live in the state you live in, the county you live in. When you start moving out into larger areas, you really do need to track where your dollars are going, and are they actually creating the change that they say that they are creating.
I think that's great. And I always say, you know, for SVP, you know, from more of, again, a grantor level, we moved away from mid-year and annual check-ins and reports. And this year we are piloting something else called monthly spotlights, where we're having conversations with each of our nonprofit partners and instead highlighting them and the work that they do. You may have seen the one we sent out last week for Look, Listen, Learn, one of our newest grantees, sharing their story, but really moving to us telling their story. You know, I'd say, you know, when you're talking about like a grantor and a grantee, that relationship is, you know, being in relationships incredibly important. I think about it in terms of personal relationships, or say a romantic relationship. At least I have never been in a romantic relationship where I get a report card or a report. And I might have to rethink it if I did. But you know, like, oh, we don't talk. This isn't, you know, there's something going on, or we have really open communication. And that's a pretty squishy thing. And I am not, for the record, a very squishy person. Like, I'm pretty type A. I did really well working in DC. I loved it. But, you know, at the end of the day, like nothing, I have also written many reports, and they took a lot of time. And of course, you know, and they didn't really get to the root of probably all the work that we were doing, because we only talked about the grant as well, where we wanted to show our full selves. And so that's just another way to think about. I think I see hand raised.
While you're looking at that hand raised, I just brought me back to the earlier question you asked, Emiko, and that is, how are things different? I remember when I first came out here and started doing some work, I would talk with organization after organization who I'd say, so when was the last time that you talked with your like 10 largest donors? And they would say, oh, you know, we really haven't reached out to them in the last 3 or 4 years or so. And I'm like, wait, you haven't called them or talked to them or sent them a note or anything? No, we haven't figured out what a new campaign is going to be. That has lessened quite a bit. But we still have organizations who essentially don't have a relationship with people who are their best friends. They're their donors. And so, you know, that's a sign of an organization of value, is when you as a donor or a volunteer have no problem picking up the phone and you get somebody that you can chat with. and vice versa. You're able to pick up the phone or shoot an email to a donor or volunteer, and they're responsive.
That's great. I see a question from Zenobia.
Yeah, to your point, Ruby, about tracking the money, I was trying to jot it down so I wouldn't forget it, but just thinking about what Emiko said earlier on in the conversation about overhead. You know, I mean, because that is important. I mean, you need to put money in, invest into the overhead in order to make the organization work, right, efficiently. Is that a flag though, if the overhead dollars are more than the service the money, the dollars that you're putting out towards service? Is that a flag of an organization if you're looking at it and it's like, wow, I don't know, 75% of their dollars go to overhead, or I mean, that's a big number, but even if it's 50%, if it's half, like what's a good balance of overhead dollars or overhead spending versus the dollars that are going to the programming and the services?
Yeah. I would definitely be alarmed at 75%. I'd definitely be alarmed at 50%. Yeah. I don't have a number, okay, but I'm going to say this. New nonprofits who are just getting started, their cost of doing business is going to be greater. They're getting started because everything is going into the operations and getting the organization up and going. The further you get into the life of the organization and its healthiness, its ability to deliver, their cost of doing business should decrease. Now, when does it go up again? If they're getting ready to launch a new project or a new campaign. If they are replicating a successful program, which means that they're going to bring on a whole nother division or a whole nother staff that is going to, replicate this, they will likely have an increased operating expense. So these things should ebb and flow. And that's why having the information from the board and the executive committee of what's going on. So if you're a long-term donor with someone, if you're a donor of larger amounts, asking them, so how are things going with the cost of doing business? Not that you are going to say, oh, that's not the right amount, but having a familiarity with what those costs are and what are they related to in terms of the stability, growth, and sustainability of the organization.
That's great. What a great question.
Thank
The
you.
other thing, Zenobia, that I would say is that it depends on the type of organization. Like if their whole job is, say, organizing people, like they do advocacy, then most of it's going to be staff because they're out there doing, it depends on kind of what they're doing versus, if you're providing, say you're an affordable housing developer nonprofit and it's all overhead, then something's off. So you also have to think about like what type of service are they delivering and where do you actually want that impact? Because sometimes the impact is the staff and sometimes it's the thing they're spending on or building or giving out. So it really depends. Ruby, we're almost at time. So just any final words you want to share from us on this post-election day?
Well, stay the course. It's not over. I'm just going to say, and hopefully you see in this election the importance of advocacy. So advocacy has played an enormous role in how this election is turning out. So you guys, the red wave did not happen. Look at why it actually didn't really happen. There are reasons that relate to the nonprofit sector and how they were involved in this election cycle. And so, they are informing on the issues, okay? And that information came to you as a voter, and I hope everybody on this call was a voter. That information came to you as a voter and was a part of your decision-making process. So I really just, I hope that you found this helpful. I hope that you understand better the connection of being a volunteer, being a donor, being a partner, advocacy, being anti-racist in your work, and coming to the table with curiosity and with something that you have to offer in terms of resource.
Thanks so much, Ruby. And we're ending right on time. What a pleasure. If you're looking for more to do with SVP, our next event in person is actually coming up November 29th. It's at the hub of one of our grantees, Choose 180 down in Burien. I am so excited. It's really, we talked about relationship building. It is going to be relationship building. You'll be able to, all of our nonprofit partners that we work with are going to be there. So it'll be a great chance to get to know them. Also, we will continue this series in December. So we put the link there. This has been recorded, so we'll share this out. And yeah, Heather is just chatting us up all the ways you can get involved, and stay warm. Enjoy the sun, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Great.